medieval authors. The 6th century provides the first identifiable British historian, Gildas, whose De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin of Britain, covers events in Britain during the 1st century. However, according to John Allen Giles, Mr. Stevenson, in the preface to his edition of the original Latin, warns that we are unable to speak with certainty as to his parentage, his country, or even his name, the period when he lived, or the works of which he was the author. Nevertheless, the work ascribed to Gildas was evidently known, cited, and, with regards to Britain during the 1st century, wholly plagiarized by Bede at the beginning of the 8th century. Thomas Wright confirms that Bede's brief account of events was almost literally from Gildas. The oldest extant manuscript of Gildas is the Cottonian manuscript of the 11th century. William of Newburgh, writing during the 12th century, accidentally discovered a copy of the work of Gildas, which is rarely to be found, for few people care either to transcribe or possess it, his style being so coarse and unpolished. A view not shared by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who extolled the elegant treatise of Gildas, and wrote of his fear of debasing so great a writer in his own Historia. Gildas is presumed to be an ordained British Christian. His information, however, is explicitly gleaned from multiple foreign accounts. Although he does not name his sources, the time of writing suggests that these amounted to Roman and church records and histories. He admits that he does not follow the writings and records of my own country, which have been consumed in the fires of the enemy, or have accompanied my exiled countrymen. He is instead guided by the relations of foreign writers, which, being broken and interrupted in many places, are by no means clear. Gildas is, however, unambiguous in his report of Rome's contrite abandonment of Britain. He explains that the Romans left the country, giving notice that they could no longer be harassed by such laborious expeditions, or suffer the Roman standards, with so large and brave an army, to be worn out by sea and land fighting against these unwarlike, plundering vagabonds. Despite his reliance on foreign sources, Gildas never mentions Claudius or an invasion, and makes no reference to the incredible Tacitus or Cassius Dio. On events in Britain during the 1st century, he provides a very concise but informative account. The rulers of Rome imposed submission upon our island without resistance, not by fire and sword and warlike engines, like other nations, but by threats alone and menaces of judgment frowning on their countenance. The Boudiccan revolt and its consequences also received paltry attention. After Rome returned to Italy for want of pay and had no suspicion of an approaching rebellion, that deceitful lioness put to death the rulers who had been left among them. Gildas goes on to say that the Senate sent the army back, and the Britons stretched out their hands to be bound. The Roman army again returned to Italy, leaving behind them taskmasters. To chastise the crafty race, not with warlike weapons, but with the assurance that all British money, whether of copper, gold, or silver, was to be stamped with Caesar's image. Gildas's reiteration that Rome achieved Britain's submission through non-militaristic methods explains why archaeologists have not yet found Roman battle sites or mass graves in Britain. Gildas's account of an agreement to stamp all British money with Caesar's image is also archaeologically supported by the virtual explosion of Roman coinage during the 1st century. Furthermore, this arrangement seems perfectly credible. It was clearly a low-risk option, which provided Rome with the all-encompassing officious prestige it dearly sought. Britain, for its part, was able to continue trading internationally without hindrance, while Rome's coined profile saturated the known world through every level of monetary exchange. Britain's trading prowess and defensive capabilities evidently made this agreement more viable than the alternative of military conquest. Caesar had already proven, and Strabo reaffirmed, that the latter was too expensive, dangerous, and ultimately unnecessary. Stripped of its ecclesiastical rhetoric, De Excidio provides several revelatory clues regarding the relationship which developed between Britain and Rome. One such valuable insight is Gildas's lamentation over the absence of writings and records of my own country. He explains that those which have not been consumed by the fires of the enemy have accompanied my exiled countrymen. It is significant that during the first half of the 5th century, the Roman Church was battling the Pelagian heresy. which was in direct opposition to the Augustinian doctrine of original sin. Pelagius, a native of the British Isles, taught that salvation could be achieved by individuals through their own efforts. Self-determination and the innocence of newborns was understandably very attractive to many Christians and was widely accepted in Britain and elsewhere, but was deemed a serious and unacceptable threat to the power and authority of the Roman Church. To extinguish the root of this perceived heresy, Germanus of Auxerre led a mission to Britain circa 429. Within 2 years, and after decades of unsuccessful attempts to subjugate the British Church to Augustinian doctrine, the Roman Church successfully condemned Pelagianism as heretical in 431. The offending British clergy were exiled and replaced by agents of the Roman Church. According to Gildas, it was these exiles who took with them the histories of Britain when they were ousted by the papal agents. The exiles are identified and located in northwest Gaul during the mid-5th century by a cluster of contemporary references. One such reference from 461 has Mansuetus, Bishop of the Britons, signing the proceedings of the First Council of Tours, the metropolitan see of northwest Gaul. This peculiar bishopric of a people identifies the unorthodox British Christians in northwest Gaul immediately after Rome's action against Pelagianism in Britain. These bishops had evidently been deprived of their native diocese, but had nonetheless maintained a significant status. Lynette Olson explains that, as Roman Gaul crumbled away the Bretons, settled in sufficient numbers to turn Western Armorica into Britannia. Ian N. Wood clarifies that British, Britons, and Bretons are indistinguishable during the 6th century. Furthermore, by the late 6th century, the migrating Britons had successfully established themselves enough to resist Guntram, king of the Franks, in 590. The exiled British community evidently preserved their British history as they colonized northwest Gaul from the 5th century onwards. This preservation of heritage is keenly demonstrated through their maintenance of the common Brittonic language, which remains exclusive to themselves, the Welsh, and Cornish to this day. Crucially, Brittany remained totally autonomous and unimpeded until the 12th century, when Walter of Oxford brought an ancient British book Ex Britannia from Brittany. It appears hardly surprising that the most detailed record of 1st century Britain should emanate from this British-speaking sovereign state. From its creation, Brittany was fundamentally a British community that was founded on its motherland's writings, records, beliefs and doctrines prior to the 430s, and as such provides the nearest and least spoiled source of information on 1st century Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia began as a transcription of the ancient book written in the Old British tongue, which Walter brought from Brittany. The translation was widely accepted and well received for centuries. However, the work was subject to numerous additions and divisions, which have obscured and undermined the significance of the original transcription. In the 12th century, William of Newburgh, an Augustinian canon and one of the most engaging chroniclers of the time, was virulently opposed to pagan elements within Geoffrey's Historia. William accused Geoffrey of unscrupulously promulgating the mendacious predictions of one Merlin, as if they were genuine prophecies, and declaring that this Merlin was the issue of a demon and woman, and attributing to him the most exact and extensive knowledge of futurity. This was scandalous in William's eyes because, as he himself explains, we are rightly taught by reason and the Holy Scriptures that devils, being excluded from the light of God, can never by meditation arrive at the cognizance of future events. William's contention was purely on religious grounds and clearly concentrates on the prophecies of Merlin, rather than the original transcription of the Brittonic source. His statement is unambiguous. Whatever Geoffrey has written, subsequent to Vortigern, either of Arthur, or his successors, or predecessors, is a fiction. The period subsequent to Vortigern is commonly accepted as referring to the latter half of the 5th century. William openly declares also that he will make no mention of Geoffrey's fulsome praise of the Britons from the time of Julius Caesar to that of Honorius, when the Romans voluntarily retired from Britain. The accusation of Geoffrey's Historia being essentially fiction lay dormant until the Reformation, when it again suffered from the conflation of the prophecies of Merlin and the original Brittonic transcription. Polydore Virgil subsequently spawned an incredible fallacy which attempted to discredit all non-Roman British history. He began by creating the first publication of Gildas's On the Ruin of Britain, which he did very unfaithfully in 1525. This was followed in 1533 with the belated publication of his Anglica Historia. The book took 30 years to complete and was ill received. It saw Polydore labelled, amongst other things, an unthankful plagiarizer of Geoffrey and an agent of the Pope. He was vehemently accused of rewriting the Antiquity of Britain to make it Roman and for severely censuring key elements within Geoffrey's Historia. Traditionally, Polydore has been suspected of burning or sending to Rome many ancient manuscripts during the Reformation, which he evidently expropriated from the Bodleian Library at Oxford under special license from Henry VIII. The 19th century had John Allen Giles describe Geoffrey's Historia as a tissue of fables which is incomparable with the accuracy of Bede. A remarkable statement considering that Bede covers Claudius's expedition to Britain and the Boudiccan revolt with only 4 vague sentences, while Geoffrey provides 5 chapters. Giles does admit, however, that Historia was met with a universal approbation, and that too from those who had better opportunities of examining the truth of it. Giles also reports that Geoffrey was an elegant writer, excellently skilled in the British tongue, and according to a certain 13th century monk, a faithful translator. Giles asserts that the original undivided transcription was said to be at Bennett College, Corpus Christi College, in Cambridge, which was never yet published. He also confirms that several other sources were known to have been added to the Brittonic transcription, including the Arthurian stories from the Welsh chronicles. There has remained an almost universal and contemptuous disregard or plain ignorance of the original transcription of Geoffrey's ancient book. Throughout the 20th century, academic articles have been woefully witless in their critiques of Geoffrey by not delineating the corpus within his Historia. John S. P. Tatlock's declaration that Geoffrey took far more pains to be easy to read than to fend off doubt in the critical is typical. His premise being that medieval history is little more than poetry. Valerie Thewars J. Flint took the debate no further in 1979 when she concluded that Geoffrey was either an historian who fell short of a full expertise at his craft or a writer of fiction occasionally curiously mired in fact. More recently, Simon Schama has continued the farce that Geoffrey was not an historian but a fantasist. Schama is dismissive of the ancient book in the British tongue, preferring to focus on the epic of a British hero, prophesied by the Welsh magician Merlin. It is no wonder that the foundations of British history have suffered so completely. Fortunately, however, and after centuries of successive and contrived failures to suitably investigate Geoffrey's primary source, Acton Griscom provided a laudable work on the Historia. In his introduction, he openly despaired that no critical or even reasonably accurate text of the Historia Regum Britanniae has hitherto been published. He laboriously investigated and identified that all circulated imprints of Historia are no more than copies of a 16th century edition itself, full of errors. And this despite 48 12th century manuscripts being extant. Griscom's examination of these manuscripts confirmed that the original transcription was completed between the springs of 1136 to 38, on account of the work's double dedication to King Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, who were in open enmity between these specific dates. Furthermore, out of the oldest extant 12th century manuscripts, none are divided and all have double dedications. Griscom's efforts have shown that the prophecies of Merlin was an unrelated addition to the Brittonic transcription. André Oldham Beaumont confirms that the slights put upon Geoffrey as a romancer, not to say a liar, are utterly untrue and are fully deserved by his correctors. The stories of Arthur and Merlin have distracted attention and prevented credence being paid to a key source of British history within Geoffrey's Historia. In conclusion, Tacitus and Cassius Dio are one of the same, a contrived illusion with no basis whatsoever. It is not purely speculative to presume the motive, money and power. However, that is not the primary intention of this exercise, which has nonetheless demonstrated the incredibility of these supposed sources of Britain's past. The works of Tacitus and Cassius Dio are no more than historical fictions, which evidently enjoyed the lucrative antique market during the Renaissance. Their creations also supported the notion of Rome's historic primacy during the pre-Protestant and Reformation challenges faced by the Roman Church. The medieval authors, on the other hand, are evidently much closer to the 1st century than the aforementioned Italian novelists. Gildas, despite his painful lamentation over his countrymen's heresies, provides crucial elements to the historical puzzle of Britain's past. Writing a century or so after the British bishops were exiled to northwest Gaul, Gildas has inadvertently located the missing writings and records of Britain in Brittany during the mid-5th century. Their preservation is confirmed by the continued language and independence of Brittany until at least the arrival and transcription by Geoffrey of Monmouth of an ancient book from there in the early 12th century. Contemporary accounts show that the exiled British bishops continued to successfully administer and govern their community in Brittany. It is fair to presume that they would also have continued to conserve the records they deemed important enough to accompany them in exile. With regard to source reliability, it is significant that the maintenance of these records was free from the control and sanction of the Roman Church. Agents of the latter inherited Britain's barren archives in the 5th century, which has hitherto allowed ecclesiastical history to achieve an undeserved primacy in British history. Acton Griscom's successful separation of the prophecies of Merlin from the transcribed ancient Brittonic book in Geoffrey's Historia is revelatory. The conflation of the two, which began as a doctrinal criticism, was maintained as a contrived effort by agents of the Church to undermine the non-Roman history of Britain, and has been ignorantly perpetuated ever since. Nevertheless, Geoffrey's faithful translation of the Brittonic book provides the oldest, least sullied, and therefore most reliable record of events in 1st century Britain available to us.